As always, I'll show you some good reps and then we'll talk about it. So for starters, when I'm demonstrating this, I'm going to be stepping forward out of my rack onto my wedges. You guys should be facing into your rack, stepping back onto your wedges. That's just not a good angle for me to film, so ignore that part. I want you guys setting up like this and then stepping back into position and doing your squats. I can't film as well that way, so I'm gonna do everything facing this way. When it comes to setting the bar height, I like to pick a hole in the rack that is somewhere below my shoulder, which allows me to make sure I can get into position and then step up and out. If you set it too high, obviously you're gonna do some weird tippy toes stuff and it's not super safe. I'd rather it be too low than too high. And when it comes to setting a hand grip width, the truth is, it is going to have a level of individualization and what is most comfortable for you. But I recommend having, if this is shoulder width, I recommend going a little bit outside that. So I'll show you guys here. If this is shoulder width here, I recommend going a little bit outside that. That's going to give you a good starting point, and you can kind of modify a couple finger widths wider or closer depending on what feels right for you. I like to use the knurling on the bar or the grippy part to kind of establish where my hands are gonna go. I know that for me, about 2 inches outside of where that grip starts is gonna be a good spot. And while there might be some benefits to using a closer grip, it has to be comfortable for you. Now, where should the bar go on your back? The bar should be resting on top of your traps. That is called a high bar position. If you're familiar with a low bar position, I don't really recommend doing it when we are doing a quad dominant squat. I recommend a high bar position, which has the bar placement on top of your traps, which will look something like this. Now, I don't want the bar placed any higher than this up on your neck, which obviously isn't a good thing. And so what we're trying to do is create a bit of a shelf with our traps, so that the bar can sit nicely right there, nice and comfortable. If you want to use a bar pad, that's okay, but I do think within a couple of weeks of practicing the bar position and holding it there, that soreness will subside and it'll feel pretty natural. Once you have the bar in position, I want you to look at my wrists, right? I want you to look at my wrists. What I don't want is I don't want this, where you drop the elbow and extend at the wrist like this. I want a neutral wrist position. You see how my wrist is bent like this when I'm holding the bar? I don't want that. I want a neutral wrist position, and I want my elbows back like this. Not pulled all the way back, but pulled back enough to maintain that neutral wrist position, right? So this is what I don't want, where those elbows are kind of dumped under and the wrist is extended like this and the bar is kind of just sitting in my fingertips. I want a neutral wrist position like this. The bar is just gonna be way more secure in this position. Next, and most importantly, I wanna talk about how we make this primarily a quad exercise and a little bit less glutes. And in order to do that most effectively, you're gonna need to use a pair of wedges or shoes that have built-in heel elevation. Reason being is when you get onto wedges, you're able to send your knees further over the toes before your heel pops up. If I were to try and execute this same technique, but without the wedges, my heel would be popping up. And so wedges are crucial to doing this exercise well to target the quads. If you don't have them, you can use a small plate to elevate the heels, and I highly recommend doing so. To set up your wedges, I like to set up at about hip width. What does that mean? If you were to stand up and wipe your feet like you just came in from the rain and you look down, that's gonna be roughly hip width. And then from there, I like to externally rotate a tiny bit, and that's my starting position. Most people are gonna feel best either here or a little bit wider, but I do recommend starting here, just so we don't get a ton of adductor. And then you just make your wedges mimic the position that your feet are in. Hip width and slightly externally rotated. Now, however much external rotation of the feet you choose to use, you need to push your knees out over the toes. Wherever the toes go, the knees wanna go. And so if you're set up squatting like this and your toes are pointed out, right? You want your knees to go out too. You don't want to have your knees cave in like this. You want to make sure that wherever your toes are pointing, that's where your knees go. And so when we have a slight external rotation like I have here, it makes that quite intuitive and pretty comfortable. If you use a really wide stance and a lot of external rotation, it's going to be hard to also push your knees in that position. But just remember, wherever your toes are pointing, that's where your knees should go. Now, when you are on your wedges, I like to have my toes on the floor. I don't really like to have my whole foot on the wedge. That doesn't feel really stable. I feel sometimes like I'm sliding down. So scoot down a little bit so that your toes are on the floor. It'll be a lot better. Now, to make this a quad dominant squat, we want to do three things. We want to push the knees over the toes. We want to stay relatively upright, and we want to think about squatting straight down. Now, before we go any further, this is going to look different for everyone. Based on your biomechanics, your limb length, your mobility, it's going to look different. So make sure you pay attention to my critique to your form and not necessarily trying to make it look like somebody else's. So what does that look like? Knees over toes, relatively upright, squat straight down. It looks something like this. Knees over toes, relatively upright, squat straight down. Knees over toes, relatively upright, squat straight down. One of the cues that really helps me do this is think about having a string attached to the front of your knees and to the back of your hips, right? So there's somebody holding a string out in front of you there attached to your knees, and someone back there holding a string attached to your hips. And as you begin the squat, they're both pulling at the same rate. And what that means is as I start to begin the movement, I'm breaking at the knees and the hips simultaneously so I can squat straight down and I'm letting my knees go out over the toes. Right? Thinking about that string pulling my knees forward and the string pulling my hips backwards at the same time will look something like this, where now I'm squatting straight down and I have knees out over toes, which is going to make this a little bit more quad dominant, which is what we're using it for. And just for contrast, this is what it would look like if you screw that part up. What a lot of people will feel a little bit more comfortable doing is pushing the hips back and squatting like this. Reason being is you're going to be a little bit stronger, and most of us have been told not to push the knees over the toes, so there's a little bit of subconscious pushback here. And so if you're squatting and you're finding that you want to push your hips back a ton and your squat looks like this, right, like this, instead of like this, I want you to dial back the weight and really focus on letting the knees go forward, squatting straight down with a tall chest. And remember, while we are talking about pushing the knees over the toes, while we are saying don't push your hips back so far, the hips will have to go back, and I want you to think more about having a nice even split between breaking at the knees and breaking at the hips so that you can squat straight down. What will happen when you do that is the knees will go over the toes. If you're doing that, chances are I'm going to give you a big thumbs up, and we might nitpick from there, but chances are it's really, really great already. And so again, to recap, you're going to get in position with the bar, you're going to find a comfortable hand position, you're going to walk backwards out of your rack, you're going to get onto your wedges that are about hip width, right? Slight external rotation with your toes on the floor. And then you're going to think about a string pulling your knees forward and a string pulling your hips backwards at the same time. And again, what will happen is as you break at the knees and the hips simultaneously, letting the knees go out over the toes, staying relatively upright, right? I'm still letting my hips go back a little bit, but I'm staying relatively upright. When we try and work the glutes with things like step-ups and Bulgarians, we do a lot of letting the chest fall forward. We do that because it's better for working the glutes. And when we want to work the quads, we want to be relatively upright. Not perfectly 100% upright, but relatively upright. And so trying to keep your chest up a little bit may help some of you guys here so you don't look like this while you're squatting. All right? This is too much hips back, not enough knees bend. I want both of them at the same time, squatting straight down, letting the knees go out over the toes. And for the 100th time, everyone's gonna look different. So make sure that you stay focused on you and don't assume that you're going to be able to squat like somebody else. We all look different when we squat. So when we're talking about squat depth, how low should you go? You should go as low as you can with a neutral spine while keeping your heels down. And so you're going to go down until one of those two things wants to fail. And what I mean is you're going to go down in your nice squat until at some point, if you keep going, you see that my back starts to round, right? Right about here, I can stay nice and neutral. But if I just sink to the bottom there, my back rounds. And so that's going to be the end of my rep. Now, it might not be something that you can feel, but it is something that you can see. So make sure you take a form video from the side, send it in so we can talk about it. The second thing that might happen is your heels might pop up. Now, if you're using wedges, that's way less likely, but it might be that in trying to push the knees so far over the toes, you see that as I get down to this position, my heel pops up. Now, what I would recommend is pushing the hips back to get the heels down, and actually you're in a pretty good position here. So if you're using wedges, I don't think this is going to happen for most people. Chances are it's going to be more of an issue of your lower back or your lumbar flexing underneath and creating what's known as like a butt wink. I don't want people freaking out over a butt wink. It's not necessarily dangerous or a bad thing, but it will signify loosely the end of your rep. If when you're squatting something just doesn't feel right, I might try playing with your foot position. Maybe making the feet a little bit wider, maybe making them a little bit more externally rotated, or the opposite. Again, there's going to be an individual foot position for you that feels the best. I recommend starting with hip width, slightly externally rotated, but some of you guys might prefer a slightly wider stance. In order to make this not an adductor or an inner thigh exercise, I wouldn't go aggressively wide for this. I would keep my stance on the more narrow side. As you approach failure, what can happen is that your quads get tired and your body's gonna try and figure out an easier way to stand this weight up. And so what might happen is you start your set with this really great quad dominant stance, right? You're going through your reps. And as you get tired, your body says, well, this is really hard. We're gonna start to stand up like this, right? We're gonna go down nice and quad dominant, but we can't get back up the way we came. We need to shift that tension to the glutes and then stand up. It's sometimes known as the stripper squat. And so if this is happening to you during your set and you can recognize it, I want you to snap yourself back into gear and think, I need to come back up the way I came with my quads. If I feel like I'm going like this and shifting that tension onto my glutes, I want you to try and snap yourself back into the technique. But if you can't, and you're at that point in the set where you have to dramatically change your technique to stand up, for now, I recommend ending the set and letting us talk about it.